Hey everybody, welcome into the Cubs Weekly Podcast presented by Wintrust, proud legacy partner of the Chicago Cubs, an exclusive home of Cubs checking. Open online today at wintrust.com/Cubs Weekly. And as a reminder, we're available on all podcast platforms, so be sure to rate and subscribe. And make sure to stream Chicago Cubs baseball today. Subscribe directly to Marquee Sports Network or log in with a participating TV provider. You can visit watchmarquee.com to learn more. I'm Andy Martinez, joined by Marquee Sports Network contributor and MLB.com reporter Tim Stebbins. Tim, thanks so much for joining us. It's been an action-packed week. It's been an action-packed few days, really, for the Chicago Cubs after sweeping the Giants in a 3-game set. This was a big series for the Cubs. This was a big series for the Giants. This was a big series for the National League in terms of the wild card and playoff positioning. For the Cubs to sweep the Giants, what was your biggest takeaway from the 3-game set at Wrigley?
Well, I got a couple, but I mean, I'll take one zoom in and one zoom out, and I'm sure you have similar. But it's just that you beat a team that is on your tail in this race, and you have to do that, right? We know how many teams are in the mix for these wild card spots when there's 3 of them up for grabs, and the Giants are a team that they've been struggling for one. So in that sense, it's good to see that the Cubs took care of business, but also it's like, even if the Giants weren't struggling, that's a team that is there in that picture and has been for a long time. And you need to beat those teams. And we know the Cubs have a lot of games, including this weekend coming up similar. If I were to zoom in though, I mean, I guess just like 2 words, just Seiya Suzuki. I mean, that was an incredible series for him. And I just think about where he was kind of earlier in August, and we know he got taken out of the lineup and sat for a few days, and since then, like he has legitimately been one of the best hitters, I think, in baseball. And this series has just kind of been a continuation of that, and really that middle of the order presence that they thought they're going to, and then he, for the beginning of the year, we saw bits of it and struggled a little bit, and now he's really emerging, and that's huge for this team going down the stretch here.
Yeah, Seiya Suzuki was such an integral part for this offense, even going into the season, right? When he was signed last season as a free agent out of Japan, it was kind of expected that he would be eventually a middle of the order bat. And there was some questions, especially last year, like how long would the assimilation process to U.S. pitching and U.S. Major League Baseball, just overall with the travel and everything that kind of goes on behind the scenes beyond just like playing on the field. And we kind of saw that the getting used to it kind of took a while, right? He never really was himself per se last season, and he struggled to kind of adjust to that. But the Cubs firmly believed when they signed him that he could be a middle of the order bat that could carry an offense when he was going right. And I think that, like, to your point, this 3-game series was indicative of that, right? Where yes, Cody Bellinger had a good series, and some other guys had some really good offensive series, but it was the Seiya Suzuki show in a lot of ways, right? Where he's hitting home runs, he's hitting some clutch doubles, the 3-run double on Wednesday against the Giants to kind of kick things off and kind of show the Giants like, hey, this is the Cubs game, then and they're going to win. I thought that was huge, and you're right. Ever since the days off, the mental reset, the benching, whatever you want to call it, those when he had that time off, that really seemed to kind of get him back in his groove. And for the Cubs, I mean that's what you hope in that situation. And I thought that was key to kind of getting unlocking the offense and getting them back on track.
Yeah, I mean, like this lineup, especially since they added Jeimer Canario to it, we know it's long, we know it's deep, and you got all sorts of hitters in there, lefty, righty, switch hitters. But I think Seiya Suzuki is as key to it probably as anybody. Just and we can see. I mean, the lineup was going well for a while. We know that, and he was going through his
Right.
struggles, and the fact that it is so deep kind of allowed him to work through that, and allowed Ross to let him get a reset, as we talk about. But he definitely takes it to a whole another level, I would think. I'm not going to say it's like, I don't want to put a number on it, like how much higher the level, obviously, but you can see just this week alone, I think in that Giants series, he had like 9 RBIs. I mean, that says something to me, man. And the fact that it's coming this time of year, like I just wonder, like, I'm excited, I guess, for their sake, and see where it goes these next few weeks, because guys, September, man, this is that time of year where 6-month long season before the playoffs, and it can get the kind of those dog days of August catching up to you, but it's really the opposite for him. And it's like, by the end of this month, what are his numbers going to look like? And then what will that mean for this team? I'm really curious to see where that is.
Yeah, I believe I saw it earlier, but since his time off again, whatever you want to call it. He's got a 193 WRC plus, weighted runs created plus, which is 93 points above league average. It's insane, right? Like if you had a 124 WRC plus, you'd take that in a heartbeat. 193 is off the charts. That was a huge revelation. And to your point, like it's going to be curious come October 1st when the regular season's over to see where he's at. And for the Cubs, if that means the playoffs, that's a good thing. Another good thing, especially if you're looking forward to the rest of the season, that we're kind of in a sense burying in terms of burying the lead, if you want to say, with Seiya Suzuki doing well was Justin Steele and Jordan Wicks in the rotation. Justin Steele, especially his best outing of his career, in my opinion, and he said it too, and I think the stats would back it up. Right, 8 innings, 12 strikeouts, 2 hits. I believe it was 2 walks. Just really, really dominant in that outing, and you could tell early on, like, oh, he's in that first inning, I'm like, yeah, he's gonna have a really good outing. But I thought like a good outing, meaning like 6 innings, 7 innings, maybe 1 run and like 5 strikeouts, and like kind of gives the like rest of the bullpen a little bit. I didn't think it would be 8 innings, 12 strikeouts, and the Giants had no answer for anything he was doing.
Yeah, I mean, look, like you don't see a lot of pitchers go 8 innings anymore. I mean, that's just the
Yeah,
reality. Correct me if I'm wrong. I feel like last season wasn't it Steele who kind of talked about one of his goals being just to throw a complete game.
it was. Yeah, yeah.
So that's just like that's no disrespect towards him. It just more speaks to the environment and how starting pitching has evolved in the last decade plus, even maybe fewer years than that. So for a team, especially that we know this bullpen's been leaned on, and we know there's some probably tired arms down there. They have a lot of days, as do many teams and probably most teams this time of year. A lot of games in a row, not a lot of days off. It's crunch time, right? But the Cubs are no exception to that. And I think that's kind of an underrated part of it. And really just a lot of these performances that we're probably getting to more of them from that series, the finale, I should say, but getting as many innings out of your starters right now is key. Performance like that, I mean, that's probably as good of an outing as you could hope for, all things considered at this time of year and just the environment of baseball. So I think I agree. It was safe to say that's probably his best start in the big leagues.
Yeah, and Tony Andrecki wrote about it on MarqueeSportsNetwork.com. The interesting conundrum, you kind of touched on it with the bullpen right now for the Cubs, right? Where it's like the other night, it was a 3-run lead, and you're kind of expecting, all right, Adbert Alzolay is going to warm up. He's going to get the save. Cubs close out the win, and it's kind of business as usual. That's how it's been, especially since Adbert Alzolay took over the closer role. It's been, he's got the ninth, and you kind of work backwards from there. But it was Julian Merriweather that was warming up. It was Julian Merriweather that came in, got the final 3 outs. That was kind of like a big kind of like, ooh, what's going on? Like, why isn't Adbert Alzolay pitching? What's wrong with him? And David Ross, before the game on Wednesday, like everyone's kind of dealing with something right now, right? If you're not dealing with something, you haven't been playing long enough, or you've missed most of the season or something, right? Like there's someone's just dealing with, everyone's dealing with something right now at this point, just given the nature of the long season. And in Adbert Alzolay's case, it's something that David Ross is trying to stay away from him as long as possible. Where he had the line where he said sometimes 4 days is better than 15 days, meaning like if a pitcher goes on the IL, it's 15 days, he's out, right? There's no 10-day IL for the pitchers. There's no 7-day IL. Like it's 15 days. So if they think they can get him back within those 15 days, they'll essentially play short for however long they need to get him, because it means you have them for those extra 11 days, 10 days, 9 days, whatever it is. Those are so valuable in the sense that you want him to be available as long as possible. And if that means you miss maybe like 4 starts and you have to go to like a Julian Merriweather, or in Wednesday's case, Luke Little, who got the last 3 outs of the ninth inning, obviously not a leverage situation, but to be able to do that, I think is huge, to be able to reset Adbert Alzolay, because the last thing you want is to lean on him, burn him out, and then you come to the end of the season and either you're in the playoffs or you're in a must-win game, and you don't have a fully healthy Adbert Alzolay. I think we saw kind of a glimpse of that, not with Adbert per se, but with some of the bullpen arms in Cincinnati, with the doubleheader, the Saturday night game and the Sunday day game. The bullpen was just gassed, and I think being able to kind of reset it, having a blowout where David Ross could save some guys, having a dominant outing by Justin Javier Assad, those guys go 8 innings and you only have to get 3 outs. Those are the things that the Cubs kind of need down the stretch to be able to preserve this bullpen so that Mark Leiter's not pitching 4 times in 5 days, or Adbert Alzolay is not going back to back and then having one day off and then having to pitch again. Like those things add up at the end of the year. You want to keep the mileage low going into October, and a stretch like this where, like, if you're a fan and you're watching, you're like, I want Adbert Alzolay to get those last 3 outs in a 3-run game. Like you kind of have to be patient because the Cubs know that that 3-run lead, those 3 outs aren't going to be as important as the 3 outs that he might need to get on September 29th or something like that.
Yeah, and I think if we want to talk about him specifically, like, we know he used to be a starter. We know he came up as one. We know he debuted and that was kind of the vision for him, and it went in a different direction. But point being, like, are his innings at a point where it's a career high where like Steele? No, but there's probably something to be said about pitching February through now September, the way he has, and the kind of the physical toll that takes on your body, whether you do have the innings or not. When you're being used, as we talk about, to back days or in 4 out of 5 or what have you, like, that's going to take a toll. It doesn't matter, how many innings you're throwing. Maybe it's a lesser toll. Like, I'm no scientist, I'm no doctor, I couldn't tell you that, but I think there's something there. And I think it's really smart if they can kind of play with it. I think you said it right there, where 4 is better than 15 or however many days if you can stay away from them. And we know they've called up a couple of guys to add to the bullpen in the meantime to kind of pick up some innings, and that's key. And then the starters, we get seeing some of these long outings, like, that's huge. But I think that's kind of another thing here that maybe we're not thinking about. Like, sure, it's not as innings career high, some of these guys, but it's a long season, and they've been used a lot in high stress innings too. So I think that all adds up, and here we are now, and we're talking about this on September 6th.
And it's interesting you say that because Luke Little, touched on him a little bit, but he makes his major league debut on Wednesday in the finale. He gets called up on Wednesday. Shane Greene is designated for assignment to make room on the roster. And Luke Little started the season as a starter in South Bend. He was a starting pitcher, working every 5th day, a starting pitching routine, getting into that. And the Cubs transitioned him into a bullpen role because they thought this stuff could play out. Clearly, that obviously, long story short, obviously worked out. He's in the major leagues. He accelerated through the minor league ranks. With him, it was an interesting thing. He pitched for the first time on back-to-back days recently in the minor leagues, and he was asked, "What was that like?" And he said, "I didn't feel the best, but I also didn't feel the worst. It was just the normal arm pain that you have." And that's interesting, right? Because this is a guy that could pitch multiple innings, 4 or 5 innings, and he's pitching in short bursts now. So the impact that the throwing has, whether it's 1 inning or 5 innings, it can be different for a lot of guys, but it's still an amount of work. They're throwing a little bit more high intensity pitches that could tax the arm a little bit more. In Luke Little's case, like, he clearly needed that day off after the back to back. We see that it's no different for Adbert Alzolay, for Mark Leiter Jr., Julian Mayweather, et cetera, et cetera. Like, they have to kind of manage these guys because of the appearance. The 100 innings that they might have pitched as a starter in their first few years isn't the same as the 50, 60 innings that they've got now. But if they're making 50 appearances, like, that's maybe 3 times in a week. Maybe that's 4 times in 5 days, like Mark Leiter Jr. Like, being able to conserve their arms is so key, because these guys are who Ross has leaned on and who he's going to lean on when crunch time comes in that final week, and for the Cubs, as the Cubs hope in the playoffs.
And I got a couple other things for you too. Like, let's talk about this. How many times do we not consider getting up, warming up, and not even going into a game? And sometimes
I was going to say really quickly, like, on that point, like, Adbert Alzolay, the last time he pitched on Friday in game 1 of the doubleheader, he gets up, starts warming because it's a close game. The Cubs break it open. They don't need to use him. Then he comes in the nightcap. What happens? A blown save. Is that a direct correlation? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe it is. Maybe it's a complete direct correlation. Adbert Alzolay will probably never admit it. He'll probably say, like, I should have done X, Y, or Z better. But that's a real thing, right? Like, he's getting his body warm. He's ready to pitch, and then he sits down, and then 4 or 5 hours later, whatever it is, he's getting ready again, and now he's pitching in a high leverage situation. Like, that is 100% real. Like, and that happens a lot of the times where a guy gets warmed up and starts throwing and has to get the body hot, and maybe he doesn't get in the game, but that still kind of counts as a day.
Yeah, and you see guys get up and then sit down and get back up even sometimes. So that's another or kind of another thing I'm thinking about here is like who's not in the bullpen picture right now. It's, among other guys, obviously Michael Fulmer, and we know
Yeah.
how much he really emerged for this team and kind of that bridge guy to the Meriwether Lighters and Alzolays of the world. And I don't, like, okay, maybe it's on the one hand you can say, well, they have other guys to kind of slot in there, but I do think that he was another option to, if you wanted to give one of those guys a day, you could just put him back an inning and maybe sub in for one of those guys, and then it all pushes back, right? And there's a lot of just factors at play here, and I think all things considered, they're managing it pretty well because they're managing to win games in spite of this. And this isn't just exclusive to the Cubs. I'm sure all 30 teams
Right.
are dealing with this, but they're winning games, and that's the most important thing.
Yeah, and in Fulmer's case is interesting too because he was a kind of the guy that could go multiples, right? And if it's like if maybe you're trying to stay away from Julian Merriweather, it's like all right, we'll give Fulmer the seventh and the eighth, and then we can turn it over to Alzolay or like if Lighter's down, like all right, he gets the sixth and seventh, and then Merriweather and Alzolay, like whatever. Like Fulmer kind of gives you that flexibility, that option, and you don't necessarily have that anymore. And I know Jose Cuas has stepped up a lot and been a guy that David Ross has leaned on, but the Fulmer one was a big one because I think his stuff could have been the nasty stuff in the Cubs bullpen. It was the two seamer was really good, the slider's really good. Like that was such a key piece to the bullpen, and the Cubs hope they can get him back soon. He might need to go on a rehab assignment. He might be good just coming straight into major league action. They don't know that yet. They'll see how he plays out, but that's a key piece to this bullpen and really take some of the load off for guys like for those three guys at the back end for the Cubs.
Yeah, I mean, think about that White Sox game weeks ago, right? Like how that was one of the biggest parts of that game. We talked about it, I think, after that game, you and I on here, like
Yeah.
strike out the side the way he did and allowed them to help them come back. It was a big part of that comeback. So, yeah, I mean, they have a couple other relievers we know that are also seemingly trending in the right direction. So the fact, I think, again, like they're managing this pretty well, all things considered right now.
Yeah, it's an interesting case, and we kind of touched on it a little bit, Tim. But I want to get more into it on the September call ups and kind of what has what's kind of happened the first few days of September, what could happen the rest of the month. And September 1st comes around. First of all, the Cubs have that weird schedule with the doubleheader, and they don't get the 29th man. When September comes, you get the two extra players, and that's it. So a doubleheader on September 13th or September 1st, you have 28 players on your roster, and that's it. The Cubs used those two spots on Canario, and they used the other one on the pitching side with Shane Greene. And Shane Greene was an interesting choice to call up because I think I include myself in this, but I think a lot of us thought that Shane Greene would just kind of start the doubleheader, would maybe fill in the rotation if he looked good. But it was kind of clear for the Cubs that Shane Greene was kind of an insurance policy, so to say. Like they saw him as this guy can cover innings. If there's a blowout, it can save our bullpen in a doubleheader. It can save the bullpen for the days coming up. That's kind of why I believe that it was him that was up because they knew they could move on from him if in a few days because they could bring up someone who was maybe a shorter length option, which is exactly what happened with Luke Little, right? Where you have that length option to cover you if things go wrong, or with all the games you're just going to need that option. Being able to have that, it was almost an insurance policy, and now you're able to go to someone like Luke Little, who can build trust. The Cubs clearly need another left-handed option in the bullpen besides Drew Smyly and besides Mark Leiter Jr., who's been a lefty specialist. So that Shane Greene movement made sense to me. Like that just made a lot of sense in that context.
I think I would agree with you, but I mean, I think too, though, I'm kind of surprised they didn't get more out of him if that was always kind of
Yeah,
an option in their bag, right? Like they didn't use him until Sunday in Cincinnati, and I know that game was pretty close. It was back and forth, and they pulled away with a big output late at the plate, but like they didn't use him until that game, and they brought him up for the doubleheader, and that was pretty much, that was a long day of baseball, a lot of pitching.
yeah,
That part surprised me, but I do think like whether they did get more, if they had gotten more out of him, like the move to potentially switch out, bring another reliever as they wound up doing with Luke Little, like I think that was probably one of the most likely scenarios or the likely scenario, even if they did get him, even if they pitched him for 4 straight days or 3 straight days, because Just keeping your flexibility intact, and some of the guys that I do have up here, like what moves are you going to make? Well, if you're going to call up that guy, you get a couple games out of him and then swap him out. I think the Reds did that too. The Reds called up
Yeah.
someone, and immediately we know what they're going through and all the roster overturn they're going through, but they called up someone, DFA'd him a day later. So it's not. I think a lot of teams are in this boat right now where you're in that time of year where you need to cover innings, you need to get guys rest, and you're going to see a lot of moves like that.
Yeah, this isn't a 3-4 years ago where you could call up 12 guys and those guys you don't really have to worry about resting guys or anything because and then you didn't have the batter 3 batter minimum, like you could throw all these guys in specific matchups. So like that kind of creates a little bit of flexibility there.
Well, and then
Tim, go ahead.
I'll just say too, like maybe you were going here, I don't know. Like the first 2 moves they made when the roster expanded, like there's still a lot of time left in this month. Like I think we both agree, right? Like if they make several more moves this month with these expanded rosters, it wouldn't surprise us in the slightest because that's where everyone's at right now.
Yeah, that was my next point, but we're going to take a quick commercial break. After a word from our sponsor, we'll kind of get into more what could happen in September in terms of call-ups, and then we'll look ahead to another series, a big series for the Cubs. It seems like the big series keep on coming. We'll be back after this quick word from our sponsors.
We know you love Chicago. You devour the pizza, admire Chicago's skyline, and cheer on Chicago sports teams, especially the Cubs. If you wanted to live in a more boring place, you'd live in St. Louis. Why not bank with Chicago's bank too? Upgrade your wallet with an exclusive Wintrust Cubs debit card, which you can get when you open a Wintrust Cubs checking account. Show your Cubs pride and open an account at wintrust.com/Cubs. Member FDIC, equal housing lender.
Welcome back to the Cubs Weekly Podcast. And we're kind of teasing some September call-ups here, but before we get into like what else could happen the rest of the month, the other call-up that we didn't really touch on too much was Alexander Canario. And I think there was a ton of excitement and definitely warranted from fans, right, in terms of why he was called up and calling him up. Guy who hit I believe it was 37 home runs last season in AAA, suffered a gruesome injury in the minor leagues, not in AAA, but suffered a gruesome injury playing winter ball, had a really long recovery that there was a chance he might not even play this year. There's even a slight chance that he might not ever play again. And he's back 8-10 months after the injury. It's kind of incredible, Tim, but there was a lot of frustration amongst Cubs fans too, because he has not been playing.
Yeah, I mean, I think for like 3 days there, if I went on Twitter, the Cubs would tweet out their lineup, or you were in Cincinnati, the writers, people would tweet out the lineups, and there would be 50 replies and quote tweets and tweets about no Canario again, and no Canario again. Like, yeah, people were upset, and I think they're still going to be upset, even though he debuted. He made his big league debut in the Giants finale. But yeah, like that has certainly been a. I think I saw someone tweet. I can't remember who it was. Is this the most united Cubs Twitter has been over anything ever? And I was like, that's a great question.
Yeah, it is a great question. And it's like, I get it, right? I get the excitement of him. That this was a guy who was as great of a hitter as Matt Mervis in the minor leagues last year. Like, to be frankly honest, like he was putting up the same amount of numbers as Matt Mervis. And so I get the excitement. But there was the Cubs were pretty transparent even before September. They mentioned that whoever was called up, they weren't expecting them to be an impact bat. They probably weren't even going to get a lot of playing time. David Ross mentioned when Canario was called up, he's low on the depth chart. Like they were pretty frank with how it was going to be. And for Canario, there was a lot of sense it made a lot of sense to call him up for a multitude of reasons. I think he was the best option in terms of who was already on the 40-man spot. The time they had one 40-man spot, that if you wanted to add someone and you weren't sure if they were going to stay on long term, I don't know if that made sense to burn that 40-man spot like that. With Canario, you already had him on the 40-man roster. You could bring him up. You could expose him to this playoff experience, because there's a chance next year, especially with how things go in spring training camp. Like maybe he's your 4th outfielder coming out of camp. Maybe he makes the team out of camp. And if you're competitive again next year, which is what the Cubs hope they are, you want Canario around the situations so that he knows, hey, day in and day out, this is how you prepare. There's value in Alexander Canario being around a Jeimer Candelario and Ian Happ, a Dansby Swanson. This is what they do every day in their daily setup. That totally, all of that like makes sense. Like all of that, it makes sense for him to be around and to be in that atmosphere, the playoff environment where like everything matters. guys have talked about like learning how to watch a game, right? Like learning what a pitcher's doing, learning how the game's developing, learning how the game's playing out. Things that you don't really learn or see in AAA or AA. You see that at the major league level. So that when Canario comes in, he's ready. And he looked pretty ready in that bat against Camilo Doval, which is no small task to ask for one of the best relievers in baseball. He had a competitive at bat against him. Ultimately struck out, but it didn't work. He didn't get a hit or anything, but it was a good at bat. That's a really good learning experience for him. Frankly, the depth chart is what it is, and it just means there's not going to be a lot of playing time for him.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things fans and even you and I and other like as media, there's a lot of things that we just don't see when we're not in the clubhouse or around, right? Like that's just the reality of it. So, and that's kind of in defense of fans, honestly, too, where it's easy to understand from my seat, like the excitement and everything. If we want to talk about the depth chart, though, like I will have no problem just running through it all. Like seriously, like
right, yeah, go for it.
Ian Happ's been pretty hot in recent weeks. Center field, I will use Mike Tauchman because I'll put in this sense Cody Bellinger somewhere else. But Mike Tauchman, we know he was scuffling there for a few weeks. Had a big game in Cincinnati. We know how much they also like him in that lineup. So okay, next, Seiya Suzuki, like we talked about him at the top, how good he's been. Another outfielder who's playing really good at first base and always has is Cody Bellinger. Like, okay, that's now 4 outfielders on your depth chart. I mean, yeah, like, and then I'll use Christopher Morel too. Like, I think for them, assuming like this keeps up, they get into October, like you need to get Morel on track, and Morel's been in kind of an extended slump. So all of this goes into what I'm trying to say is like, there's only so many at bats to go around. I just named like 5 guys, and that's your priority. Your priority right now is making this push, and maybe you never know. Like we never know what kind of spark someone coming up and who's done really well down there and is a well-regarded prospect. You never know. You can kind of at this time of year play that kind of card almost, right? Like you're probably going to go with the more predictable outcome of the two, and I guess play it safer in a sense because it's crunch time, right? So I think you even wrote about this. Like you got to stick with your guys, and that's kind of the crux of it to me.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to touch on. I wrote about it, as you mentioned, on MarqueeSportsNetwork.com. Like David Ross said it multiple times, like it's go time, and he's going to lean on the guys that have gotten him this far. And frankly, if the Cubs want to get into the postseason and have a postseason run, the guys that are going to help him do that are Cody Bellinger, are Ian Happ, or Seiya Suzuki, or Mike Tauchman. Like those are the guys that are going to get the Cubs to where they want to go. And if they're struggling, like they're not going to solve a struggle by sitting on the bench for an extended period of time, right? They're gonna get out of it by playing. And David Ross had an interesting point earlier in the week where he said sometimes you could face some really good pitching and go like 0 for 4 or struggle, and you feel like you're in a slump and you feel like you're going wrong. But maybe you face Brandon Woodruff and Corbin Burns on back-to-back days, and then later you face Graham Ashcraft, and it's like you face 3 really good pitchers. So like, are you really slumping, or did you have really, really tough matchups that give you that mentality that you're struggling? That sometimes could happen, and he says he doesn't know that that's for sure that's happening with these guys, but that is something that you can think about, right? Where it's like you face some really good pitching and you don't have the results, and you start thinking like, oh, I'm scuffling, I'm struggling, like what can I do? Maybe nothing's going wrong, it's just those guys were really good, and that's kind of how it worked out for the Cubs right now. Like they want to get those guys going because they are the guys that are going to help them go deep in the postseason, and that's what they're trying to do right now. Like David Ross mentioned it, unless they're really, really like scuffling or hurt, like she mentioned the scuffling, and unless they're like really, really hurt or need some time off, like these guys are going to play every single day from here on out to the end of the season. We saw that with Cody Bellinger. They need his bat. They want him in the lineup, but he wasn't feeling it 100%. Okay, he's going to go DH for a couple of days to keep his bat in the lineup, but also keep him off his legs and keep him fresh. Like that's kind of how it's going to be the rest of the way. There's no time to kind of, well, let's give this prospect a chance. Like as you mentioned, to maybe we'll get lightning in a bottle. Like that time is over. The resting time is over. It's about trying to win baseball games, and the guys that are going to help you win baseball games are your core of 9 to 10 guys that you have been playing day in and day out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of a good way. Well, one thing you just said that resonated with me was that time is over. Like, I think there's been comparisons in this Canario conversation amongst the fan reaction I've seen where it's to Christopher Morel, and kind of there was a similar, maybe when how they talked about it when they brought him up from Iowa in May, like, so many at bats to go around, and then what happened? Well, he hit home runs in like 5 straight games, and that's a different time of year, though. I mean, I think that's just kind of the bottom line.
And I was going to say, sorry to interrupt, but like that's the different time, but that was also a different situation. If you remember that, like they were frank and said, like, we don't know where we're going to find playing time, but he's hitting so well, we just needed to have him up. And a couple days later, Nico Horner gets hurt, lands on the IL. There's immediately an opening at second base, and Christopher Morel took it and ran with it. Like they were pretty frank that there was not necessarily a spot for him, but things broke for Christopher Morel, and he got into a rhythm, and then essentially turned that into being the full-time DH for most of the season.
Yeah, and I'd have to look back at where that call fell on the calendar, but May was their worst month, and the way he was hitting, like, yeah, you're gonna once he comes up and he's going, like, okay, you're gonna ride that for a while. I think there's like, not every situation is not created equal, right? Like,
yep.
The Diamondbacks are coming to town, and their top prospect, one of their top prospects, Jordan Lawler, he just got called up. That's also a team that I believe he's not even a third baseman. He's middle infield, but they're going to play him at third because their third base production has been so bad since like June. So every situation's different, when you have a top prospect or a minor leaguer who's doing really well, and like you want to call him up. Well, in one situation on the other side of Wrigley Field this weekend, in one dugout, it's you need production. You're gonna let it ride and see what you've got. In another one, it's you've got a lot of guys and only so many at bats to go around, and it's just different. It's entirely different. So I think I get it. I think I would say this. I'm kind of surprised it took until Wednesday to get Alexander Canario in at bat, especially with some of the scores they put up. But I also think, like, if that's something I'm nitpicking at, then that's not the end of the world to me. If that's the one thing I can nitpick here.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll mention on that end is, like, yes, like, yeah, I totally with you. Like, I guess, yeah, maybe you could have seen them in that last game in Cincinnati where the Cubs totally blew out the Reds. But, like, again, to that original point that I made about wanting to get these guys going, like Talkman had been scuffling, had a 3-hit game. Like, you don't want to pinch hit him. You want him to feel good about himself at the plate. He gets a 4th knock, like, gets things going. Like, those situations make sense. Where I think it could have maybe gone differently was like maybe as a defensive replacement in the 9th inning, like get one of those guys off their feet for a couple minutes, like maybe that. But again, then that's you're really nitpicking, and I don't think that really makes a whole lot of sense in this case. But you did touch on the Diamondbacks, and before we wrap up, I want to look ahead to the series because it seems like and David Ross has joked about it, like every series is big right now at this time of the year, but with the playoff implications, with the wild card, like this is just as big as the Giant series that they just wrapped up.
Yeah, I mean they've been playing big series since like July, like mid-July. I mean, take out whenever they start, take out the London series, they come back and okay, it's a big series against the Phillies, a chance to get to 500, and then did not play well. So yeah, they've been in that mode for a while. Yeah, I mean they've got the Diamondbacks twice, 2 series in the next week and a half to 10 days here. And that's a team that, again, like kind of like the Giants, the Diamondbacks were playing really well. And then they went into a deep struggle in August, and they kind of kicked it back up a bit. But I think since then it's been kind of in the middle. I think it's just the same thing. Like all of these series right now, it's really a unique opportunity for the Cubs. Like the fact that, the Brewers are at the end of the month, and that has the chance to be huge if it's not already huge. I mean, but you have teams that are right around you in this playoff push. I mean, this is your chance. Like the Red Series, I know they lost 2 games in the 9th inning. They were walked off, but like they split with that, and that's kind of like at the least what they needed to do, just to keep ground in this race and keep these teams at bay. And this is going to be no different to me in that sense.
Yeah, it's really a like right? Like ideally, like they have admitted, like they would love to win the division. They would love to, if not finish in the top wild card spot, so you could host a playoff series, right? Like that's what you want, that 3-game series to be all at your place. The Giants are on a 6-game losing streak, and the 3-game sweep has really put them in a tough spot as they chase down a wild card spot. But before that losing streak, like the Giants were in the last wild card spot. They held a 1-game advantage over the Diamondbacks, and now they're 2.5 games back of a playoff spot. Like, you have a good series against the Diamondbacks, and it can kind of push them down to where you're at the point where you're feeling comfortable about being in the playoffs. And that's like the first step, right? Like, you just want to get in. You want to have the lottery ticket, as people always say. You want to get in, and beating these teams, winning these series puts you in a position to do that and be able to go on a run.
Yeah, I kind of look at the Phillies right now. Like, there's a lot of baseball left. So, like you're saying, it's getting to a point where maybe you can start. The Cubs aren't gonna. We're not saying the Cubs are gonna get comfortable and start kicking their feet up and taking it easy. But as the games fall off the calendar, the math becomes the math. But I look at the Phillies. Like, the Phillies are 5 games up. They're a game and a half up on the Cubs for the top wild card spot. But the Phillies are firmly in a wild card spot, and I think, as the month goes on here, like, the more you can kind of increase, how far ahead of you are of the next team or the team that's right outside the picture. At some point, as I said, like, the math is going to be the math, and you're going to be in a position where magic number talk is going to be starting, and you have to get to that point first. But, once you're there, it's kind of at that point just finishing it off.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting time, and this series against the Diamondbacks is going to be huge. Make sure to stay tuned on Marquee Sports Network and on MarqueeSportsNetwork.com for all the coverage. It's going to be a jam-packed week. It's going to be a jam-packed final few weeks. Keep posted on the Cubs Weekly podcast, where we'll keep you updated on what's going on. Tim, thanks so much for joining me on this edition of the Cubs Weekly podcast. It was a blast.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That'll do it for this edition of the Cubs Weekly podcast presented by Wintrust. Don't forget to download and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcast, and check us out in video form on the Marquee Sports Network app and YouTube. For Tim, I'm Andy. Thanks for tuning in.